you very much. It's as Johan said. There's your. I have a number of connections to Sweden. It's always a pleasure to be here. There are a number of friends in the audience, and I hope they'll still be friends after the talk. I also have one son who lives in Sundsvall, and I shall be going there tomorrow to see him and my 2 grandchildren. So I can cheerfully say to any of you, if you want me ever to come to Sweden again, I will say yes. Because I have a lot of reasons to be here. But on top of that, and that's what the purpose of today, is to see if I can get you on side. You're a very rational country. I've for a long time been impressed by the Swedish approach to alcohol control, which is much better than ours in the UK and probably the best in the world. I'm going to try out on you today a talk which I've only given really once before, which is to try to raise the challenge that scientists have in thinking about drugs, particularly drugs which are currently illegal, but which may well hold the key to understanding significant aspects of human neuroscience and also may offer new treatment opportunities. So I hope that you will agree with me by the end of my talk that this is something that's worth doing and maybe help me try to make the kind of changes that are necessary. And maybe Sweden could lead the world in terms of this. But before I get on to that, just to make sure you all know exactly who I am, I'm a psychiatrist. I don't know if the joke goes down in Swedish, but with a name like Nutt, there weren't many options. It clearly does. I went into medicine to do research on the brain, and I've been very fortunate. I've managed to achieve my goals, and I think I've certainly done as much as I could have hoped for. I've worked in the USA. I ran the alcohol research ward at NIH for 2 years before coming back to England. But mostly I've worked in the UK. I've had 4 children, as I say, one of which now lives in Sundsvall, and he's improving the quality of the soccer up there. But more importantly, they've all survived teenage, and that's been quite a challenge, them and their friends. I've seen a lot of things as they've gone through teenage years that I hoped I wouldn't see, but it's made me a lot wiser about what young people do and the harms that they may come to. And the other thing to say is I was the UK's chief advisor in terms of the harms of drugs for 10 years. Until I was sacked in 2009. And that sacking really is the beginning of the discussion. It caused a bit of a stir. You can see this is the front page of a weekly newspaper. That's me being throttled by the Home Secretary. I guess you'd call it the Department of the Interior head. It's a great caricature for many reasons, not least. It makes me look like a doctor with a white coat. We don't wear white coats in psychiatry in Britain, I think. The book of cannabis is falling from my grasp, you can see there. But the key element in that particular caricature are the scales of justice at the bottom left. And you see the scales of justice, and the caricaturist has summed up the debate very well. Because you see on the left-hand side of the scales, beer and cigarettes. On the right-hand side, you see some plastic bags with strange green chemicals in. And they've said beer and fags are worse than the green chemicals, and essentially that's what I was saying. I was arguing that the hysteria that was being whipped up in Britain around drugs, like methadone, was actually wrong in terms of the relative harms they produce, but also actually a deliberate ploy by the government to avoid tackling the big issues of harm, which are tobacco and alcohol. And I'll just give you a few examples of what the government said is why I was sacked. They said I was getting involved in policy, and it's a strange thing, but you might imagine that the senior scientific advisor would be interested in policy, wouldn't you? But they said I was giving mixed messages, and this is a health warning to you. If you think that I'm going to lead you astray, you better leave now. I said horse riding was more harmful than ecstasy. Now, that is true, and I won't spend any time discussing that at present, but if you look at the data, it's clearly the case that riding horses, particularly if you jump over fences, is more dangerous than taking ecstasy. And that alcohol is more harmful than cannabis, which is, again, unquestionably true, so much so that the government's chief scientist, who's actually The environmental scientists said it was right. And they said they'd lost confidence in me, which of course is political speak for the fact that I wouldn't toe the line. So that's the background. So what's the evidence on which I made these statements, and how does this play into the question of how we should control drugs? So I want to start off with a fundamental question. Now, there are a few pharmacologists in the audience. So what is a drug? And who says what a drug is? Now, this is the most important slide you'll see today, because this is what the drinks industry wants you to believe. And this campaign has been so successful that the majority of people in Britain think alcohol is either a foodstuff or some kind of lifestyle choice, and it's not a drug. I know that the same is true in Sweden, but I imagine so. And the argument goes like this. Well, if alcohol was a drug, well, it would be illegal, wouldn't it? And because it's not illegal, it can't be a drug. And that circularity of argument pervades almost all debate at the level of the media, at the level of the public, and sadly, at the level of science as well. And we have to challenge that. This is what I say. This is my definition of a drug. Something a politician once used, but now regrets. Now, again, I don't know if that's true in your country, but in our country, every time someone becomes important in politics, they're asked the question, what drugs did you take? And the Home Secretary that I worked with for some time, Jackie Smith, said, oh, I smoked cannabis at university, but I didn't enjoy it. And you kind of say to her, well, why bother? And the truth is, of course, that was the only way to get into the Labour Party at the time, if you were in Oxford. And David Cameron, our Prime Minister, there's a younger version of him there, he said, I did things when young that I shouldn't have. We all did. And David Cameron comes from a very privileged background. It's called Eton. And Eton is a school full of rich young men. And what the we there are the Tory front bench, most of whom went to Eton. And what they did were take drugs of different sorts, but in common, they all began with the same letter as David Cameron's surname. So you can work out what he took, even if he won't tell you. I guess it might be K in this country anyway, but CK, whatever. So what is a drug? Well, this is what a drug is. It's a chemical which produces physiological changes in the body. And in the context of the discussions we're having, it's the balance between pleasurable effects, desirable effects to the user, and undesirable effects or damage. And that's the tension which underpins all discussion about the drug laws. And I want to show you two examples of the arbitrariness on which we consider the harms of drugs in this country. Now, these are two images, public images, of people who've died from taking drugs. On the right-hand side, this is an image back in 1992 of a girl called Leah Betts. Leah Betts died after taking a couple of ecstasy tablets on her 18th birthday, and she misunderstood the health message, and she thought if she felt ill on ecstasy, it was because she was dehydrated. But that's true if you're dancing all night, but if you're just organizing your 18th birthday party, which is what she was doing, then she wasn't dehydrated, but she drank 7 liters of water during the course of the afternoon, and she eventually died of brain edema from water poisoning. The guy on the left was a student at Exeter University, one of the top universities in Britain, and he died, like many university students do, after a drinking game when he lost the round. The forfeit was to drink more, and he progressively got more drunk, lost more often, and then eventually lost his life. Now, what's interesting about these two individuals, they're about the same age, but Leah Betts' death was put on billboards all over the country. That's a billboard on the side of the road. Sorted. She's dead, she's sorted. Sorted is the slang expression for having enough pills to make you have a good evening at a rave. Gavin's death, just a little snippet in a local newspaper near where he died. Why is that? Why is there a difference? Well, the difference is that Leah Betts died of ecstasy, supposedly, and at the time, the drinks industry in Britain were terrified that young people would switch from alcohol to ecstasy. So they effectively underwrote an advertising campaign against ecstasy, which was all over Britain. It didn't work, or at least it didn't stop people using ecstasy, but it probably did encourage some people not to use it and to drink instead. But there's no campaign against alcohol, despite the fact that many, many more people die of alcohol than ecstasy. So here you have the deaths in the UK. The latest data, we have 80,000 deaths from tobacco, 8,000 from alcohol, about 1,200 from opiates. Ecstasy, cannabis, methadone, vanishingly small. Yet almost all the public dialogue about drugs is focused on the drugs which don't kill you. And as I say, I think that's to a large extent a ploy to avoid a dialogue about alcohol and tobacco. And the difference between alcohol and tobacco is that alcohol kills young people. Tobacco kills people in their middle to later ages. So alcohol is, I think, the real drug to target at present. And here is one of the best examples. Now, I guess you all have heard of Amy Winehouse. Was she popular here? And most people don't realize she died of alcohol poisoning. Most people assume, because she was a pop singer, that she took drugs, which she did do, and she died of drugs. But the drug that killed her was alcohol. But there's been no public campaign to stop young people poisoning themselves with alcohol based on even a very eminent and talented person like her dying. And that's because we don't want to face the truth about alcohol, because most of us drink, and most of us would prefer it wasn't as toxic as it is. And in fact, she's not alone. About 3 young people a week in Britain die simply of alcohol poisoning. And about 10 die of consequences of alcohol, such as traffic accidents or violence, or just falling in front of cars or into rivers, etc. And one of the reasons most rational people think that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol is because no one has ever overdosed on cannabis. You cannot kill yourself, either intentionally or unintentionally, by poisoning. And the other point to make is date rape. We did several reviews of date rape in the 2000s, and we came to the conclusion that about half of all date rape is just alcohol, and the other half is alcohol plus some other drug. And the other drug could be anything from hypnotic through to cocaine or MDMA. But alcohol is far and away the most dangerous drug to young women and makes them particularly vulnerable, as you can see from those images. And in Britain, this policy we have of ignoring alcohol has led to one of the most remarkably chilling changes in public health that I think probably we've seen in the last century. So what you see here are graphs of what's called standardized mortality rates. The likelihood of anyone in Britain, an adult in Britain, dying of one of these disorders, a disorder of the blood, diabetes, endocrine, liver, etc. And you can see all these reasons for dying are going down. Over the last 40 years, standardized mortality rates from every organ system have gone down, sometimes by 2/3 of what they were in 1970. And that is because, as a population, we're getting healthier, and that's because medicine's getting better. But the one system which has completely bucked the trend and has gone up 5 times is liver disease. And 80% of that rise is due to alcohol. So we have a tsunami of alcohol-related deaths. Liver disease will kill more men in Britain than heart disease by the end of this decade. And we do nothing about it. We actually deny that it's a problem. And now alcohol is the most common reason for death in men between the ages of 16 and 50 in the UK. And that's because the average man starts to get drunk from the age of about 14 on a regular basis. And there's a lot of hysteria about drugs affecting the brain. You read stories supposedly from scientists, a single spliff will kill 1 billion brain cells. Cocaine damages the brain. The one drug we absolutely know damages the brain is alcohol. There is unequivocal data. We've known that since we were dissecting brains 200 years ago. But here's some images from our ongoing study. We're scanning people who are abstinent from alcohol, from heroin and cocaine, to understand vulnerability to relapse. And we didn't expect this, but we didn't expect people who could give informed consent to these studies to have brains as damaged as these alcoholics. You can see here comparable age-matched controls. The damage that these alcoholics suffer in terms of their brain is greater than that of many people with Alzheimer's disease. Unquestionably, alcohol is a brain toxin. And you might say, well, isn't it strange, with so much evidence about the harms of alcohol, that the governments don't do anything about it? Well, our government has deliberately avoided it. And what it's done, it's used this little quirk of epidemiology to justify doing nothing. So what you see here are a series of ways in which you can die, going from lip cancer to chronic pancreatitis. And their mortality rates are scaled according to how much you drink. And you can see, for all these ways of dying, there's a relationship between alcohol consumption and death. Some of the relationships are very steep, like hemorrhagic stroke and cirrhosis, and others are flat. But they're all upward. The only one that bucks the trend is this one here, where in men, there is a slight benefit for alcohol consumption in middle-aged men, protecting against ischemic heart disease. And that was the justification why the last Labour government, the Blair government, said, we cannot make decisions about intervening with alcohol because we cannot weigh up the benefits and the harms. That. I want to compare it now with cannabis. This is another caricature. This is the Home Secretary who sacked me. This is me, by judging by the moustache in the spliff here. And the argument was that cannabis was a more harmful drug than people had realized, and therefore should be reclassified. And I opposed that reclassification because it meant that more people would go to prison for possession, and there would be greater levels of interaction between the police and young people with cannabis. And the government were desperate, because it was coming up to an election, to have the policy changed so that they could appear tough, strong on drugs. And they came up with this idea that cannabis caused schizophrenia. Now, actually, you're to blame for this, because the only study in the world that has ever been powered enough to look at the relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia is a Swedish conscript study. When 1 year, I think it was 57, they interviewed people when they went into the army and then followed them up. And based on that study, people have assumed that there is a relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia, which there is, but it's weak. And it's what is remarkable about cannabis is that in the 40 years since people in Britain started being prosecuted for using it, the number of users has gone up 20-fold. So we've seen this massive change in the use of cannabis, and that's been true in most of the Western world. I imagine it's true in Sweden too. Now you might think that if there was some measurable relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia, that rates of schizophrenia would have gone up too. But in fact they haven't. Nowhere in the Western world is there any signal that this massive increase in use has translated into an increase in either psychosis, the prevalence and incidence, or schizophrenia. In fact, if anything, these rates are falling. If you take the Swedish data at its face value, then you can estimate that to stop one case of schizophrenia, you've got to stop 5,000 young men or 7,000 young women from ever smoking cannabis. Now that is not a very easy thing to do, using a public health measure, and to do it by criminalizing young users, which is what the government did, our government did, is outrageous and ridiculous. But that was the result of this over-interpretation of the cannabis schizophrenia data. That was the smokescreen that they used to justify their behavior. Which gets us to the question, then how should you assess the harms of drugs? Obviously, you can't let politicians do it because they will clearly serve their own purposes. And we thought long and hard, and in the 10 years I worked for the government, I tried to develop ways of transparently assessing drug harms. And after some time, we came up with this scale of harm, which is published on the government website. And this derived from essentially a consensus meeting where a group of experts, about 40 experts, listed all the harms that you could ever think of that a drug could cause. Everything ranging from dying from injecting heroin to deforestation in the rainforests of Peru. And we had hundreds of sticky notes all over the room. And then over the course of the 2 days, we coalesced them into these 16 harms. And of these harms, 9 of them relate to what the drug can do to harm you, the user, and 7 relate to the harms that a drug can do to society, the harms to others. And then we did a separate conference where we did use multi-criteria decision analysis, which I haven't got time to go into today, to rank the harms of all the different drugs and then to weight the different harms. And when we did all that, we came up with this graph, which Johan showed you. And this was the graph that was published in this Lancet paper here. And it showed, and I have to say, to my surprise, because I wasn't expecting this, the previous way we'd done it, alcohol had come up about 5th. But using this more sophisticated methodology, alcohol came out as the most harmful drug in the UK. And the way you interpret this graph is to look at the colours. The size of the blue histogram relates to the harm the drug does to the user, and the red part is the harm to society. Now you can see that the most harmful drug to the user is crack cocaine, followed by heroin, followed by crystal meth. But the most harmful drug overall is alcohol because of this vast harm of alcohol to society. And we know in the UK alcohol is responsible for over 50% of all domestic violence, child sex abuse, burglaries, traffic accidents, etc. So this enormous social harm is what puts alcohol to the top. And of course that's because it's so widely used. And that's why we should do something about it. Drugs like tobacco score lower and cannabis scores lower again. And these drugs at this end, ecstasy, LSD, etc., magic mushrooms, there are almost no social harms at all. There are some harms to the user. Now, people say, well, that's just these UK experts. You know, maybe the UK is a different place to the rest of the world. And so we then went away and we did it again. And we did this recently in Europe. This was an interesting experience. We got experts from 20 European countries and we did exactly the same thing. And they ranked the drugs differently, they weighted the drugs differently, but when you pulled all the data together, you got the same result. Alcohol being the most harmful, heroin, crack. So it looks as if this is a real phenomenon for Western Europe, that this scaling of drug harms has a validity across UK and Western Europe, and this has been submitted for publication now. So what that tells us is that there is no correlation between the harms of drugs and the way in which drugs are regulated in the UK, the Misuse of Drugs Act. There is no correlation whatsoever, and the same will be true in your country too. Now, most of you will say, well, that's not surprising. We've known all along that alcohol is harmful and it's not controlled. But it does matter, and it matters because if the law is based as it's supposed to be based on the harms of drugs, and if it's not based on the harms, then it's an unjust law, and people are being prosecuted unjustly. There is a man in prison in Britain for 24 years for making LSD tablets, because the judge said that every LSD tab was equivalent to a milligram of heroin, so he just totted up what the amount of heroin would be and gave him 24 years in prison, which is like 3 times you get for killing someone. So there are real consequences to having an unjust law. But the other point, and this is the point I want to really develop in the second half of my talk now, is that these laws have had a really negative impact on research. And that this effect has been profound, but it's been insidious. And most of you don't know what impact it's had. In fact, I don't think I knew what impact it was having until I decided to test it a few years ago. And some of you hopefully will have seen this review. This came out a couple of months ago. This is essentially the distillation of what I'm going to tell you for the rest of my talk. This is the evidence base to support the point I'm making, that the drug laws are hugely detrimental to research in neuroscience and to the development of new treatments. I'm going to start with LSD. And it's particularly appropriate to talk about these Nobel Prize winners in this room, and maybe they get their awards here, I don't know. Was it built when Crick got his? I don't know, but maybe not. These are the two most important Nobel Prizes in the history of medicine, no question. So decoding DNA, and Kary Mullis, the guy that worked out how you could tell whether your burger has got horse meat or cow meat in it using PCR. Almost everyone, even at school now, uses PCR as science. So Kary Mullis explicitly said, I saw PCR through an LSD trip. Crick, and yes, that's what he says. He said, I saw the DNA evolving into serpents of DNA, and that's how he got the idea. Francis Crick started using LSD after he discovered the double helix. And that is why he stopped being a molecular biochemist and went off to be a professor of consciousness science in America. He actually left the UK because he was terrified he was going to be imprisoned for using LSD, because he continued to use it after it was made illegal in 1964. So actually he's a great loss to British science. And it's kind of amusing now, we're building a huge institute to him in London. It could have been a lot simpler if we'd actually not let him go in the first place. And I think Crick would support this statement by Einstein, that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness as created. And of course that, I think, was why he was using LSD, and that certainly Kary Mullis would support that. And LSD is a fascinating tool. It was discovered by Albert Hofmann, who saw the value. Sandow were completely convinced that this was going to revolutionize neuroscience, and they made it available widely throughout the world to educated scientists who wanted to study it. And in the 50s, there were about 1,000 clinical papers, 40,000 patients were studied, 40 books, 6 international conferences, and the results were seen as generally really rather encouraging, rather effective. But it's no longer being studied. Why is that? Well, I want to give you an example. This was a paper that was published last year, which was a fascinating attempt by 2 Norwegians to do a kind of retrospective meta-analysis of the LSD alcoholism trials. And they went back and they dug out the data and they applied modern meta-analytical techniques to the data. And they showed that LSD therapy for alcoholism has an effect size which is greater or equal to any current therapy. Now, alcoholism, as Johan here will tell you, is a difficult disorder to treat. And this is so here we have evidence of efficacy for a drug which we've not been allowed to use for the last 50 years. Why is that? Well, the answer is because of the Vietnam War. Because American youth did not want to go and kill people in foreign countries, and they started migrating to San Francisco and taking LSD. And the social change that this portended was so great that it was seen as a threat to the whole way in which America structured its life. And so the drug had to be banned. And the CIA and the DEA invented stories about the harms of LSD. And eventually they got it banned. And they got it, it's a remarkable story because they got it banned even in the face of opposition from the US government. And this is a wonderful quote from Bobby Kennedy, who was going to be president. He would have been president if he hadn't been shot. And he said, why, if clinical LSD projects were worthwhile 6 months ago, why aren't they worthwhile now? Why are you banning this drug when it used to be so useful? We keep going around and around. If I could get a flat answer about that, I'd be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about my question? And of course, he knew absolutely that the DEA were essentially lying about the harms. He knew that this was a policy made by bureaucrats who wanted to stop the change in consciousness of America, and he knew that this was false in terms of the scientific value of the drug. But even he couldn't stop it happening. And that is exactly what has happened in the drug laws in your country and in my country. They have been made largely by people who have no knowledge about drugs, no interest in drugs, no knowledge of neuroscience, and they have been perpetuated by police and other regulatory authorities because that's what they do, this thoughtless perpetuation. And I would say that this is certainly one of the worst examples of scientific censorship there's ever been. And in fact, I've struggled to find a worse example. I have succeeded, but you've got to go back a long way. You've got to go back to the time of Copernicus, when the Catholic Church banned any writings and any study, effectively, of the heavens using telescopes, because they didn't want people to know that the Earth went around the sun, not the other way around. Now, I throw that out. If any of you think there are other worse examples, some people say, oh, what about the Bush ban on stem cells? And I would say, well, that was bad for American stem cell researchers, but it didn't apply in Europe. Whereas the drug laws, which are now fossified in the UN charters, apply right across the world. In fact, they're applied so rigorously that many people are executed for possession of small amounts of some drugs. So I think it's an outrage to humanity, and it's been a massive, had a massive deleterious effect to science, because most drugs which are banned have very important scientific potential or medical potential. And I'm going to talk about ecstasy and psilocybin. LSD for terminal illness there's a very powerful studies done in the 60s showing how it can help people come to terms with dying in a much better way than opiates. And mephedrone, the drug we heard earlier on. Mephedrone was being developed as a treatment for addiction, which it probably is, but now it's been banned. It's going to be very difficult for people to pursue it. And that's because the current regulations make it almost impossible to research these drugs. The regulations are completely non-selective. They stop people possessing them for personal use. They make it very difficult for scientists to work on them. And as I showed you on an earlier slide, since the LSD was banned in 1964, there's been one study. And I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong because the nature of the consciousness changes reported under LSD are profound, and the therapeutic potential is enormous. So a few years ago, we decided to start doing this research in the UK. And we started working on serotonergic hallucinogens. There are some of them here, LSD, mescaline, etc. And they all are 5-HT2A agonists. And the one we decided to work with was psilocybin, magic mushrooms. And we did that for two reasons. The first is it's short-acting, so if we found people had trouble with it, then the effects would not be enduring. And it doesn't have the same opprobrium that LSD has. Although I can tell you we are starting the first ever British LSD imaging study shortly. So we decided we'd start with psilocybin. It's a moderately potent 5-HT2A agonist. We give it intravenously because we can't afford to give it orally, because it's too expensive. The regulations make the costing of these drugs so enormous. I'll just tell you a few things about these receptors. They're fascinating receptors. The 2A receptor is massively expressed in the cortex. It's particularly expressed on layer 5 pyramidal cells and on the fast spiking interneurons which regulate these cells. You can see them in this layer here in the rat brain and the monkey brain. These receptors have evolved to control the parts of the brain which are really important to you and me, i.e. the cortex. But we don't know what they do. So we decided to find out what happens if we stimulate these receptors. And this is what happened. And it's completely unexpected. So this is one of those examples where you get the opposite effect to what you'd imagine. We assumed that giving someone psilocybin and letting them see a whole plethora of pretty colored images would activate the visual cortex. But it didn't. What it did was switch off the thalamus and switch off the default mode, the posterior and anterior cingulate cortices. Completely unexpected finding, which itself, that finding itself, tells you that study was worth doing. Because you could not have modeled that, no one would have expected that, but until someone did the experiment, you could never have known. And the magnitude of the hallucinatory experience was predicted or correlated with the magnitude of the attenuation in brain blood flow. We did it two ways. We did an ASL study, and then we thought we'd be better do a bold study. We did a bold study. We got the same results. And what psilocybin does is it switches off brain activity in these key connector hubs, the anterior and posterior cingulate cortex. These are the nodes of the brain which integrate brain function, cortical function, in the posterior, the visual and motor and sensory integration, and in the front, more the emotional and consciousness, sort of self-awareness integration. So psilocybin dampens down the parts of the brain which orchestrate and regulate cortical function, and let the brain therefore do its own thing. So it kind of liberates the brain. So under psilocybin, you're seeing brain activity that isn't constrained in the normal way in which the brain is constrained. And we thought that was really interesting. Interesting, the referee said, oh, well, this is just an effect on blood vessels, because everyone knows that these drugs change blood vessels and blood flow. I kind of thought, well, if you can change blood flow and produce these effects, that's quite interesting in itself. But never mind, yeah. We're all neuroscientists, let's go and let's see what happens to neurons. So we went on and we did a MEG study. And MEG just measures the changes in electric activity in neurons through changes in magnetic dipoles, as you know, and it's got very high temporal resolution. And we found essentially the same thing, this profound reduction in the power of the MEG signal across the frequency range, particularly in the posterior cingulate cortex and in these high frequencies, or higher frequencies in the anterior cingulate cortex. So this confirms what we found with the BOLD and the ASL. These drugs profoundly alter the brain, but not all the brain, just these particular integrative hubs. And in fact, with MEG, we were able to do use a technique called dynamic causal modeling with Carl Friston, and we were able to evaluate this model of cortical function where you have a couple of pyramidal cells and a couple of interneurons which regulate them, and from the MEG signal estimate that the predominant effect of psilocybin is on these deep layer 5 pyramidal cells. And I think that may be the first example where in a human you can actually point to an effect on brain function targeted at a particular cell type in the cortex. It's just come out in J Neuroscience. And since Tony Svensson's here, I wanted to just say a little bit about the psychotomimetic effects of psilocybin in this model, because there's always been this interesting idea that maybe the psychedelics mimic some forms of schizophrenia. And one other thing that was very clear in terms of the analysis of the psilocybin effect was the fact that the separation, which you normally see, a very clear separation from the default mode network, the anterior-posterior cingulate areas I've shown you, and the Taos-positive network, the network which is engaged when you're doing things like giving talks, etc. And here you see, in a normal situation, there's a very clear distinction in terms of metabolic activity in these different regions. So here's the default mode, and when the default mode's up, the Taos-positive is down, and when the Taos-positive's up, the default's down. They're anti-phase. And that's how the brain works, essentially. When you're doing things, you don't want to be reflecting on things, and when you're reflecting on things, you don't want to be doing things. And these boundaries, we thought would maybe get broken down in psychosis. There's evidence here from a number of studies that this separation becomes less defined in psychotic states and also in other conditions like meditation. And here's a description from one of our subjects who said, it was certainly quite different at times to know where I ended and where I melted into everything around me. So the sort of ego dissolution that you see in people with schizophrenia. And so here you see it. Oh, this is actually, no, this is another slide that I thought would entertain some of you. This is a recent study looking at separation of default mode and Taos-positive in smokers. I guess some of you smoke. And if you take smokers in withdrawal, you have much less good differentiation of the two networks than when you give them nicotine. And I thought that was quite interesting because that explains why nicotine is useful to people who smoke, because it makes their brain work in a more differentiated way. But it also raises this interesting question, again, for those of you interested in schizophrenia, why nicotinic agonists might be useful in schizophrenia. Because it might help separate those two networks which are collapsed in schizophrenia. And here you see them collapsed under psilocybin. So here's the before the psilocybin, the antiphase, the quite good differentiation, and under psilocybin, the two systems becoming less differentiated. So this might be a model of psychosis. In fact, we're doing a study now trying to see whether we can block this with new antipsychotics that don't just work on the 5-HT2A receptor. But another fascinating thing emerged from this was that psilocybin switched off this part of the brain called the subgenual anterior cingulate. Now, this is a part of the brain which is intimately involved in depression. In fact, we know that a whole range of antidepressant treatments, SSRI, CBT, ECT, switch off that part of the brain. That's the part of the brain which seems to drive depression. And we were surprised. We didn't expect that. But many of our subjects said even though they were taking this trip in a brain scanner, there were still beneficial effects on their sense of well-being for up to a few weeks later. And based on that and the parallelity with these other studies, we've got funding now to do a trial of psilocybin in depression. Now, again, you would never have thought of doing that, I think, unless you'd actually had this evidence of the brain changes being meaningful in that disorder. And I want to finish by talking about this trial. Did it get onto Swedish TV? Did any of you see this? Yeah. So this is a rather remarkable study. This was a study we did for Channel 4, the UK TV programme. And the reason we did it for the TV was because I couldn't get funding from anywhere else to do this study. No one's interested in studying illegal drugs. Most funders, particularly charities, are scared of getting labelled as working with druggies and working with people outside the law. But Channel 4 were amenable. The truth is, they asked me to do a study on TV of cocaine. And I said, I'm not interested. I know what it does. It's been done in America. And they went away, and after 2 weeks they came back and said, well, what would you do? And I said, I'll do MDMA. So we did. Why did we do MDMA? We did MDMA because MDMA is the most promising treatment for chronic PTSD, treatment-resistant PTSD. And PTSD is a massive problem in society. It's a particularly big problem in societies that are at war. And this is an amazing statistic. More American soldiers have killed themselves since they've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan than have died in combat. And they've done it. They've killed themselves because they're so psychologically damaged by the experience of either killing people randomly or being blown up or seeing their friends blown up by improvised explosive devices. And the treatments we have for PTSD are rather poor. But MDMA offers a new approach. And this is a very important study published a couple of years ago by a group in California. And what they did was they took people who were still suffering from PTSD despite classic treatment, and they randomized them to a psychotherapeutic intervention with placebo or a psychotherapeutic intervention in which they were given 2 doses of MDMA a week apart as part of a therapy session. So we're not giving MDMA every day, we're giving just 2 exposures. And they found the ones who had the psychotherapy under MDMA, about 80% went into remission, having been treatment resistant. Now that is a very powerful effect. And it's worth exploring whether that might be achieved through other means than MDMA, but also understanding why MDMA might do it. And in fact, the effect is long-lasting. So the year follow-up showed the ones who got better, all but one stayed well. So if we can really get people out of chronic trauma using a drug like MDMA, that could be a very major gain in terms of the treatment of these disorders. And so I was therefore interested to know what MDMA did in the brain, because no one had ever studied it in the way that we studied psilocybin. And here's the data. It's not yet published. But what you can see is that the first thing is to say, again, like with psilocybin, there was no area of the brain where there was an increase in activation. All the changes are blue. They're all they're all reductions in brain activity or brain blood flow following MDMA. The second thing you can see is they're in very different regions to those we saw reduced under psilocybin. These are subcortical effects, largely, of MDMA. And in fact, if you look at, say, the amygdala, you see the magnitude, the greater the switch off of the amygdala, the greater the sense of, this is a measure of intensity of drug effects, positive drug effects under MDMA. So what MDMA seems to be doing is switching off limbic systems. And that's presumably why it disengages people from their trauma or their traumatic memories. And we were able to show that if we looked at people's bad memories, now these are normal controls, they don't have PTSD, but we were able to get them to relive negative experiences in their life. And we presume that one of the benefits of MDMA might well be to allow people to relive the trauma of PTSD without having the severe dissociation that they often get when they try to re-engage with the trauma and get cognitive control. So we predicted, and we were pleased to see that, in fact, MDMA did attenuate the negative emotions. It did also increase positive memories. But this is what we were looking for. We thought maybe this would be justification for using MDMA in psychotherapeutic settings. And we were able then to show that these effects of MDMA to reduce traumatic or bad memories were due to alterations in blood flow in the posterior cingulate and the insula. So we think now we have at least the beginnings of an understanding of the brain circuitry on which MDMA works, which may potentially help us develop it, or maybe alternative drugs as therapies. And alternative drugs would be a really interesting strategy. We have identified quite a few potential MDMA analogues which could have a greater safety margin than MDMA. The problem is, as we identify them, our government systematically bans them, just in case they might leak out to people who want to use them for fun. And in fact, we've met a problem a bit like the Catholic Church back for the days of Galileo. And here, this is an elected representative of our people, able to make laws in Parliament, who's actively seeking to stop our research. And the theory behind it, I don't know kind of why he's doing this, but I think it's really the clue is here. Why was Professor Nutt allowed to use an illegal drug? And this exemplifies the problems of legality. People cannot be rational when something's illegal. And that's why we have to be very, very cautious about making anything illegal, because it stops the way people think. That's why we should not give criminal records to young people for possessing cannabis, because it labels them for life as criminals. And people cannot be rational about things that are illegal. So we have to minimize the spread of illegality through our society. I want to finish by coming back to a Swedish model. And I've been fascinated by snus. I like the way in which you have taken the problem of tobacco and reasoned that if you could make a safe tobacco, you would have major health benefits. And snus is unquestionably one of the great success stories in terms of drugs of abuse there's ever been. And based on that, I've been thinking, why don't we do the same for alcohol? And I could. I have identified at least 4 compounds which would be credible surrogates for alcohol. They would be free of the liver toxicity, the heart toxicity, the brain toxicity, and you'd have an antidote. So you could go to a party, have fun, take the antidote, drive home safely. Now, this is within the realm of modern neuroscience. It's actually not difficult. So why doesn't it happen? And it doesn't happen because investors are terrified that this drug would fall foul of those people who want to make things illegal to stop young people having fun. And therefore, it hasn't yet happened. But maybe if any of you in the audience have got a nice supply of cash, we could take it forward. Maybe this is the country, this is the rational country to develop a safe alcohol. I'd like to think so, and do see me afterwards if you want to take it forward. So. I'm going to finish by plugging my book. This is a book which tells what I think is the truth about drugs in a very simple way. It's a book which is designed for the general public, so you can buy it for your parents for Christmas, and then you can read it yourself. And all the proceeds go to a charity I've set up called the ISCD, which tries to tell the truth about drugs and educate people about the way in which the drug laws actually are seriously damaging, not just to drug users, but also to scientists. So thank you very much.